The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming out. We're going to do something a little bit different in this webinar than we've done in the past. We're going to build a workflow solution from beginning to end, and it's going to be fully functional, and it will include the SharePoint components that are required as well. I'm going to build a simple leave request solution, and once I've done that, that'll probably be 20 to 30 minutes. Once I've done that, I'm going to go in and flesh it out with some additional functionality that you might want to add once you're a little bit more familiar with the product, or if you are familiar with it already. By no means things that are necessary for the solution to work, but examples of what could make it more powerful and allow it to integrate with other business data and systems that you might have on your network. All of that should take around 50 minutes or so, and that'll leave us plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Before we get stuck in though, just a little bit of housekeeping. Take a look at the screen and find the phone number for your region, just in case you get disconnected from VoIP. Most of you are connected through voice over IP, and you may want to reconnect over a phone bridge in your region for whatever reason. If you do, you can use the access code there on your right, and once you've jotted down the phone number on the left, then you'll be able to join that way as well. This information is also in the original invitation you would have received for this meeting. Just in case you don't have it in Outlook, there it is again. Regarding questions, please feel free to ask them along the way. You'll see a little raised hand icon in your GoToMeeting control panel in the upper right of your screen. You can click on that and type in whatever questions you might have. And I should get to most of them by the end of the session. If I don't, we've got recordings of your questions, and you're also given the opportunity to put in further questions and feedback on the session overall just before you log out. So one way or another we will get to you. Don't worry if we don't get to you in the session itself. There's the control panel that I was talking about, so that should be pretty familiar to you, I think, by now. All right, let's just get stuck in. What I've got on the screen here is a workflow, or I should say a SharePoint 2010 portal. It's pretty straightforward. It's similar to a solution that we've used for other demo purposes, but I'm going to create a brand new solution. And I'm going to start by creating a new site on this home page. We're looking at essentially three components for this solution. The first is going to be the site. The second is going to be two different lists that we'll use to manage the requests. And the third component will be the Nintex workflow itself. So without further ado, I will go in and create my first component, the site that we're going to use. And I'll filter by site, and I'm going to start with a blank site to keep things simple and clear. And we'll call this site Leave Demo, and we'll append Leave Demo to the URL that is already being used for the home page. I'm going to add an option, and that is to inherit the navigation from the parent site. So that means that once I've created this site, I'll still get the tabs and links appearing at the top of the screen that I can use to navigate back to the home page or to other sites sitting underneath the home page. See, there's my site, Leave Demo. If I refresh this, then it'll come up in the tab. There it is in the tab. And there are the other links that I've inherited from the parent site, so I can still get back and forth easily. Okay, now we need the lists that I mentioned. So I'm going to create two different lists. The first is going to be the list that contains the requests themselves, and the workflow will run under that list whenever a new item is added, whenever a new leave request is submitted. And the second list will be in the form of a calendar. It'll be saving and displaying dates and date ranges, and that calendar will be used to display when people are on leave. So as each leave request is granted, the calendar will display the person's name and the leave and the length of their holiday, so that managers can look at that calendar for this particular business unit, let us say, and see when their employees are on vacation. And it help them decide whether more employees should be given leave, among other things. So I'm creating my new list, and once again it's going to be blank, so I'm going to make it a custom list. I'm going to call this one leave requests, and it's already going to display on the quick launch here on the left, so that's fine. Go ahead and create that. So there it is there, leave requests, and now we're looking at the list. Pretty boring so far, just a title and the attachment. So we need to flesh out this list a little bit. This is probably the part that involves the most imagination, because you have to picture what the form is going to look like that users will fill out to submit their request. You have to picture the fields that they're going to need. So things like what kind of leave they're asking for, how long they're going to be on leave for, between which dates, etc., etc. And you need to create a column for each of those form fields, so that when they add an item, each of those columns will represent a field and will trap all the information. So you'll see exactly what I mean when we start this up, but the first thing that we're going to want to do is take the title column. I'm going to change that to description, because it makes a little bit more sense in the context of a leave request, and we don't want a whole story about why they're taking leave, so a single line of text is fine. We definitely want this to be required in the form. We want them to have to fill out that field, or else they won't be able to save the item. And then we're going to add some more. So we've got description, created by, modified by, we probably won't use. And the next thing we're going to want is leave type. And we're going to make this a choice. So they'll get a drop-down menu, 3 choices here by default, just to show us how it's supposed to look. And I'm going to give them annual leave, sick leave, and something called special circumstances. Depending on what region you're in, you may have different things like carers leave or emergency leave and whatnot. So I'll just use one category for that kind of thing. It'll be a drop-down menu, and we will definitely need it to be a required value to force them to fill it out, and the default will be annual leave. So that's fine. Now we're going to need a date range, the time, the start and the end date that is going to make up their leave duration. So as you can imagine, we'll have a column called start date. This will be a date and time value. Once again, it'll be required, and all we need is the date. We don't need the actual time as well, so that's fine. And again, for the end date. And once again, date and time, required, and date only, all good. It's not enough to just know the time span between the 2 dates. We also need to know the hours, because the time duration might include weekends that are not counted against their leave balance. It might even include legal holidays, which also wouldn't be counted, and the person might be requesting a half a day as well, which none of that is going to be apparent from the start and end date. So I'm going to create another column called total leave in hours, and we'll make that a number and require it. So we're getting pretty close now. All I need at this stage is a column I can use to reflect the status of the request itself. So by default, you'll get a column in the list that's named after whatever workflow is running on that list. SharePoint does that automatically, and of course these workflows that we're creating with an Nintex workflow are still SharePoint workflows. So that column will still appear, but it's only going to say in progress, errored, running, that kind of thing. Nothing really terribly descriptive. So I want a column where I can say whether it's pending, approved, or rejected. So I'm going to create a column called approval status, make that a single line of text, not required because the user isn't going to fill that out. And I'll give it a default value called pending. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, if we make this a field that the user is going to see, what's preventing them from filling out the status as approved when they fill out the rest of the information? Well, nothing is preventing that. But we have a master plan, and we have a diabolical plan for getting around that. So bear with me, and you will find out soon. So we've got all our columns now. Now what we need is a view. We have one view created by default by SharePoint called All Items, but it's not necessarily going to contain all of the columns that we want. It might contain some that we don't, and it might be in a different order than we'd prefer. So I'm going to edit this view, and I can see right away that I don't need the attachments column, so I'm going to untick that. And I know that I want to start this list with the person who created the item. In other words, the person who submitted it. So that's the created by column. So I'm definitely going to tick that, and I'm going to move that to the first position. And now we can start to see how they fall into place. Number 2 we're not using. Number 3 is the description. I think I'd rather have the leave type as number 3. The description will come after that. The start and end dates, the hours, and then the approval status. So the rest of that order is just fine with me. So we will accept that. And there's our list. So this is what it's going to look like. So that looks pretty good. Everything looks to be in order. So I'm going to jump back to the site itself and create our second list. You'll remember that the second list we're using will be for storing and displaying the dates that people are on holiday. So I'm going to create, once again, a custom list. Calendar. You can see it's one of our selections here. We're going to call this leave calendar. And that should be all we really need. And there's our calendar. Again, if we browse and go back to our site homepage, we can see the 2 lists that we've created there on the left. Now all we need to do is display them on our homepage. So we're going to use web parts for that. We're going to edit this page. So we go to the page ribbon, edit the page, and we're going to add web parts. We're going to use a web part to display some of each of those lists on the same page. So the first web part is going to be our leave request list. You can see it, it prompts us there. It assumes that we're going to add lists and libraries, and that's the default setting that it gives us. We'll add the leave request list. There it is. Now we're going to add the leave calendar. There it is. And I'd like them in the other order. I'd like the list at the top, so I'm going to drag that up so that that appears at the top of the page. And that's it. You got to love the SharePoint 2010 drag and drop. It makes this stuff so much easier. Okay, there we go. Both web parts ready to rock. So now we're ready to turn on Nintex workflow for the site that we need it for this site, in fact. So under Site Actions and Site Settings, we're going to manage site features under the Site Actions setting. And you can see that Nintex Workflow 2010 is sitting there. That's the state it will be in if you've just installed it and you haven't activated it for this particular site. The nice thing about the way that we handle workflow as a SharePoint application is that it's essentially compartmentalized, so you can activate it only on the sites that you need to use it for. And it's one of the reasons why it makes it quite suitable for a hosting environment as well. If you're on shared infrastructure or even a shared SharePoint farm, then you don't have to worry about it leaking into other sites belonging to other people. Back we go to Leave Demo, and now we're ready to build our workflow. So I've gone to the Leave Request list, I've gone to the List ribbon, and now, because we've enabled the feature, Nintex Workflow 2010 for the site, we have these 2 additional choices at the bottom of the workflow settings button. Create a workflow and manage workflow with an Intex workflow. So we're going to create one. I'm not going to start with a template. If you wanted to, you could. If you open a workflow, then you can select to show a template page when creating a new workflow. And then when you did a new one, you would get this, a selection of templates. But we're going to go blank. All right, well, the first thing I'm going to want to do with this workflow is make sure that the approval status is correct. You'll remember that it is possible for users to fill that field out when they submit the item. So what we're going to do is update the item right away to overwrite whatever they may have written in there. So I'm using the update document, oops, I'm using the wrong action. Using the update item action, and we're going to update the current item, in other words, whatever has been submitted that this workflow is now running on. And we're going to select approval status, and we're going to type in pending. So that way the status will always be correct. And I'll name this just to make it clear. I like to rename all of my actions just so that anybody looking at it will understand immediately what's going on with the workflow. I think we can send a notification to the person who submitted the workflow just to let them know that it's been received and it's underway. And I'm going to browse in the little address book here, the little lookup icon, and I'm going to select Initiator. You're going to see me do this a lot in this demo. And the subject will be the leave type, so I'm going to get that from the properties, item properties, leave type, and leave type request. So they know what leave request we're referring to, and I'm going to keep it really brief and just say your leave request has been received. And I'm going to send this by instant message. So we're using Link in this particular demo environment. If you're using OCS, that'll work as well. We can do all kinds of very cool things with Link and OCS, including interactive approval over instant message with an automated approval bot, you can say. And I'll show you that a little bit later. But for now, all we're doing is sending this guy or girl a message letting them know that the leave request is underway. And we'll just call this request received. Okay, now we're ready for the action itself. This is how the manager is going to receive and process the request. So in fact, now that I mention it, I think I'm going to be a little bit more verbose in this notification. I'm going to say the leave request has been received and forwarded to, I know that I'm going to send this leave request to the person's manager, so I'm going to use the manager value for my lookup. And when I do that, what I'm actually going to do, or what the workflow is going to do for me, is go and check an Active Directory for that person's user account, for the initiator's user account. It's going to read the manager field, and it's going to use whoever is specified there. So if you don't have managers filled out in Active Directory, it's not a huge deal. There's a lot of other ways that you can assign people to respond to actions dynamically. You can get it from things like other SharePoint lists, from the SharePoint profile store, from Active Directory, from spreadsheets, from documents, even from other applications on your network. But this is the easiest way, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so we're sending it to the person's manager. Once again, our handy lookup icon. Use the manager field there. And we're going to enable lazy approval. Lazy approval is great because it means that people with workflow actions to respond to can do it via email or even instant message. They don't necessarily have to fill it out in SharePoint, which makes a whole lot of things possible. So for now, I'm just going to enable it, and we'll get a look at how that looks in a second. And I'm going to modify my task notification to give this person a little bit more information about the action that is actually being given to them. By default, I've got a link to the item in question, in other words, the leave request that they can click and they can look at it. And we've got links they can use to actually respond to the request in SharePoint, but I'm going to give him all the information he needs right in the email. I'm going to say give myself a bit of space there. A leave type request is being submitted by initiator's display name, so they get the full name of the person, not just the Active Directory username. They're asking for total hours. Remember, it's a number, so we're going to say total hours of leave between the start date and the end date. So now they really have all the info they need. They don't need to go to SharePoint to view the item. And I'm also going to tell them they can respond via regular text to the email or to the message as well. So I'm going to say you can also respond by replying approved or reject, along with any optional comments on the subsequent message lines. Good. We'll call this manager approval. Well, that's a bit optimistic, really. How about manager response? All right, we need some more actions depending on what happens with this request. So we're going to need to update the status again. So I might just copy and paste this guy here to here and to here. Copy paste is our friend. We're going to set the status to rejected. We're going to set the status to approved and jump in here and change the actual value so that it looks right. Rejected and approved. Cool, so our list item is now being updated to show what happened. Some notifications again would be common courtesy. Again to the initiator, letting them know what's going on. And we're just going to tell him or her that it's been approved. Or rejected. I don't think we need to be too descriptive in this example. Maybe we'll say sorry. Sorry, you're not going anywhere, buddy. Not a cranky boss. And for the approval, we'll give him the good news. So again, remember I said I'd be doing this a lot. Initiator is a popular one. And leave type, request. Good news. Your leave request has been approved. And that's going to be instant message, which reminds me that I need to configure the other one for instant message as well. I like to use instant message when the notification is not terribly critical. It's more of a common courtesy. If they happen to be in front of the computer, then it'll pop up and say, hey, here's what's happened. And they, people like that because they don't have to look in their email. It's very quick. If it's something that you want people to have a record of, or it's important to track it or make sure that they've received it, then email is the way to go, I think. Okay, the last thing that we're going to need to do is update our calendar. The calendar list that we created that shows when these things are granted and where everybody is. So we're going to need to create an item in the list. I might do that first, just in case anybody is really, really fast and checks the calendar before they do anything else. Like look at their notifications, for example. We don't want people looking at their notifications and then checking the calendar and seeing that it's not there, just in case they're extremely fast moving from email to SharePoint. So we're creating it in the Leave calendar. You can see that we've got a drop down of the lists and libraries in this site. We're going to create it in the Leave calendar. It's going to be an event. That's fine. The title is going to be the let's say the initiator, created by, and the type of leave that they're taking. So we can see at a glance in the calendar who's absent and why. Very good. Start time is going to be a list lookup because we're going to look up that value in the other list, in the list where the leave requests are actually stored. And we're going to look at the current item, and we're going to look in the start date field. Of course, similarly, for end date, we're going to do the list lookup for the current item, and that's going to be the end date. And there's our calendar item. Pretty straightforward stuff. Let's call this update leave calendar. And that's pretty much it. That's our leave request solution. So I'm going to go into the workflow settings just before I publish this, and I'm going to give it a name. Something wild and crazy like leave request. And I'm going to set this workflow to start when items are created. So that's pretty important. It means that it kicks off as soon as an item goes in there. If not, then it's just going to sit there until somebody goes and uses the context menu and selects the appropriate workflow and runs it, which would be really bad because, remember, as people are filling out this form, they could always write in that it's been approved, and if we're not running a workflow against it, then that'll just sit there with an approved status. So we definitely want to run the workflow every time an item is created. Save that and publish it. Very good. So just to reiterate the scenario, I'm envisaging a single business unit here. So somebody's specific department in a specific geographical location, and they want to manage their employees' workflows centrally, and they want to be able to see at a glance who is gone and when. So I'm going to play the part of an employee named Eden Stafford, and I am going to select or submit a new leave request. So I am going to my brother's wedding in Canada in a couple of weeks, which is actually true. That's exactly where I'm going, and I'm going for longer than this, but in this case I'm only going to select 4 days. If any of you online would like to buy my brother a wedding present, then please feel free to do so. I'll be sending around the gift registry to everybody after this webinar is complete. There's my new item. You can see that it's already kicked off and it's already updated the approval status to pending, and that should click along nicely now. So while it's doing that, I'm going to go and I'm going to start fleshing out some more features in this workflow. You can see already it's being processed and it's letting us know that it's being sent to our manager. I can see I've done something wrong here already. I selected manager instead of manager's display name. That's why it's showing the Active Directory username rather than the manager's full name. So while I'm here, adding all this new goodness to our workflow. I may as well go and correct that. Notification, here we go. And there's what we want to change. There we go, manager's display name. Okay, let's put our little imagination hats on now and think of a slightly more sophisticated scenario. Let's say that in addition to displaying the leave for our own little business unit, we work for a company that has a team that spans several geographical locations. They're a delivery team providing services to our customers, and we want to be able to track in a central location whenever somebody in the services team specifically is away. And we want to do that in a central location for everybody across all the offices and all the geographies, because that services team is assembled from different locations. So we need to know more than just who is on leave for any particular business unit. I'm going to imagine that this central calendar is on another site. It's on our corporate portal, and our central home office portal is actually living in Office 365, just to make it a little bit more complicated. A lot of people are moving to SharePoint Online, so let's use that as our example. So I'm going to want to update another calendar, and I'm going to want to do it in a different site, and I'm going to want to do it in Office 365. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is determine whether the person submitting the leave is part of the services crew, part of the services department. So when a leave request is approved, we're going to query the SharePoint profile store. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can record information about users and query that within Nintex workflow, but SharePoint profile store is a pretty popular one, so I'm going to use that. We're going to query for the initiator's profile, and we're going to look in the department field, and we're going to store the result of that query in a variable called department, and it's going to be a single line of text, and there we're going to store it. So now we know what department the person is in. We'll call this find department. Incidentally, I have a little window open here on our manager's inbox, and of course while we've been talking he's received notification for the workflow that we just put through, and there it's giving all the information that we've provided, and it's telling them they can click links to respond. Here's what it looks like if you do it via SharePoint. So for managers that are connected to SharePoint, they're sitting in the office, for example, or they've got a decent broadband connection at home, that kind of thing. This works great because they can fill it all in. They get a nice little form here. They can delegate and do all kinds of interesting things. But they might not be sitting in front of a computer, and they may not be part of the corporate network. They might not even be an employee. They might be a contractor or somebody who's a member of some other business partner who's associated with the process. They might not even have a company email on our network or even access to SharePoint at all. So it's good to be able to do this instead. Just say approved, enjoy the wedding, send that through. So that's lazy approval. Okay, we found out what department this person is in. Now we're going to create a conditional statement called a run-if statement. And the run-if statement is only going to run the actions inside it if the condition is met, if the condition is true. So we'll configure the condition so that it's looking at if any value equals value. It sort of gives you the most flexibility. And you can choose under value workflow data, and the workflow data is the variable that we created to store the department value. So if the department equals services, then this is going to run. Now we need to update that calendar in the Office 365 site. So we're going to do that by using something called Nintex Live. This comes with Workflow 2010. It's free, and it's a catalog of online services and actions that you can use to do all kinds of things. And we can see here that our leave request is being approved. Very nice. The catalog can do all kinds of things. It can do things like check your flight status. It can do translation and currency conversion services. It even has social media features like blogging and tweeting and updating Facebook statuses, and the list goes on and on. These things are being added to on a pretty regular basis by a whole bunch of different service and action providers. But the one that we're interested in most is SharePoint, and we want to create a list item in Office 365. So I'm going to add that to my toolbox. I'll click OK, and now it's updated my toolbox here on the left with an Nintex Live section, and there's my Office 365 action. So from here, it's pretty straightforward. It's filling out URLs and credentials, and it's very much like the update or create list item that I used earlier for the regular SharePoint environment. It's not a lot of brain surgery there to worry about. I'm going to take that out because I don't want to start updating Office 365 sites. I just wanted to show you how it works. And I'm going to make a change to this while I'm in here. And I'm going to use instant messaging instead of email for my lazy approval. So I'm going to go into the task notification and switch it from email to instant message. And I'll change the notification a little bit because it is an instant message and not a text, not a regular email message. So I'm still going to give them the same information, and I'm going to say, if you don't respond to this message in 15 minutes, you will receive an email copy. You can respond to this email version by replying, etc., etc., etc. So this is a default behavior, by the way. If the instant message lazy approval doesn't receive a response, the person's away from their desk or they just don't answer, then in a few minutes they'll get it by email as well. So there's no risk that anybody is going to miss out on a process because you select instant message. It's not like the standard notification where it just sort of goes out there and nothing happens with it. It's smart enough to know that if it doesn't get a response, it needs to go via email. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to try this out. I'll submit another one. And let's say I'm sick now. I've come back from my wedding. I'm sick. So we'll say I've got the Canadian death flu. I work in Australia and they don't know what kind of horrible diseases we have in Canada, so I'm going to tell them that. We'll say sick leave, and I am sick immediately following my return from Canada, conveniently, and I need 40 hours of sick leave. If I get away with this, I'll be impressed. Okay, save. And away we go. So while we're waiting for that to complete, I'm going to show us a little bit more added value. I'm going to get this ready. Let's say there's our leave request received. Let's say that I want to provide the manager with a little bit more information than we're giving him. I have a human resources application on the network or finance application that is responsible for maintaining the balance of people's leave as the requests go in. We have somebody in HR updating the balance so that their payroll and their paychecks reflect the amount of annual leave that they have left that will be paid. Now, I want to automate this. I don't want to pay somebody to sit and update stuff from one application to another. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to call a web service to talk to that HR application. So this is probably the most technical bit that we're going to see here. This is the first and often the last opportunity that people have to actually inject code into their workflow. But it's going to be quick and painless, I promise. So we're going to call this web service. I happen to have the URL right here. Come on now. And of course, a web service is just a means of talking to an application on the network. So I'm putting in the URL, some credentials. And you can hide these credentials if you want. You don't have to type them in directly into the browser like this if you don't want to, but I'm just making it easy for myself. I'm going to refresh this page, and what we've got now is a selection of web methods. And a web method is essentially a conversation you can have with this application. And the conversation we want to have is called get hours. So obviously I've prepared this ahead of time. But the good news is that most applications, most line of business applications, have web services built into them. And if they don't, it's usually not a huge task to add something as simple as what we're doing here. So even if it means a little bit of dev work to do this kind of integration, it'll be minimal. And there's our web method, get hours, and there's the code. And we would need to add to this code in order to give it the information and request the information that we needed. But because it's Nintex workflow and everything is easy and wonderful in the land of Nintex workflow, you can just click SOAP Builder, and we prompt you for the parameters that web service needs, and you don't have to type any code at all. So the parameters it's looking for is the username, the person who's requesting the leave, whose balance we're retrieving, and the type of leave that they're asking for. So not hard to do. We're going to use initiator for the person who's requesting, and leave type is going to be item properties. For the current item is going to be leave type. And that's all we need to tell it. We need to store the result that comes back. So I'm going to create another variable, and I'm going to call this leave balance. It's going to be a number, and I'll save that. Now I've got a variable we can select for the result. Whoops, wrong one, leave balance. And we can save it. Now we can give that information to the manager before they approve. So we can go into the manager's notification, and we can add a little bit more info. We can say they currently have, and we want a workflow variable. They currently have leave balance, so it's going to be number, the number of hours left in their balance. So now the manager is making a bit more of an informed decision. So there's a heap of ways that you can integrate the data and applications on your network. It's really not just the web service. In fact, the web service is the hardest, or at least the most technical, but I use that one because it's also the most generic and the most common, because it doesn't matter what application you've got, chances are you can use this. But we've got a lot of other options here. On the left, under the integration tab, we've got drag and drop CRM actions. We can pull information out of Excel and Word. We can query it out of databases and the BCS, even BizTalk in the SharePoint Profile Store. So there's a lot of options for this kind of integration. While we've been talking, our manager has been prompted again, and this time it's an instant message. And it's saying it's an automated message. Are you available to complete a task now? We'll say, leave me alone. Not accepted, yes or no. All right, so let's do it. There's our information, and we can reply with approve or reject. Actually, we're not saying how we can reply, but we're saying you can reply with approve or reject in the email. So let's say I don't know how to reply. Let's say we want to fire this guy. Nope. So there's the possible outcomes. So it doesn't matter how you configure your workflow, whatever outcomes you've given it, and we can provide far more than just approve and reject. those outcomes will be parsed and they'll be given here as options. So you don't have to worry about somebody not being able to figure out what to do. So we'll say approve. To complete your response, please provide comments. Let's just tell them to enjoy the wedding. Oh no, this is sick leave. Okay, in that case, I don't believe you're sick. I want proof. And we'll leave that proof up to up to your imagination. Yeah, there we go. We've already got our response. Good news, your leave request has been approved. So that's the instant message interaction. That's the link OCS style interaction. So if you've got link in OCS or OCS, then that's probably something to consider. Again, it's sort of a cultural choice. If you've got managers that are usually sitting in front of their computer and they're plugged in and they like to action things quickly, then by all means, go for it. If not, then email might be a better way to go. But again, if they don't get to it, they're going to get an email copy in 15 minutes anyway, so they're really not going to lose out with instant message. Okay, one more thing I wanted to show you before we go to Q&A. In our example here, we've got a bit of integration, but there's a weak point here in our design. The weak point is that every time an end user or a power user or a business analyst or project manager or whoever is designing your workflows, every time they want to use that bit of integration, they would have to go in and they would have to configure all this technical stuff. And unless you're a developer, you're not going to be able to do that. And we don't necessarily want to expose that configuration and these actions, these technical actions, in the design at all to begin with. We want to keep things simple visually, and people that look at the design should be able to understand exactly what's going on. So what I'm going to do is create a workflow, a user-defined action. A user-defined action is a wrapper that we can put around as many actions as we want so that they're exposed as a single drag-and-drop action over here on the toolbox. We're simplifying what that sub-process is doing, and we're making it reusable by anybody by pre-configuring everything it needs ahead of time. So bear with me, this will all become very apparent and obvious in a second. We're going to want to configure and create a user-defined action. So under Site Actions, in my Nintex Workflow section, I have Manage User-Defined Actions, and I'm going to create a new action. This isn't the only way to create custom actions, by the way. You can do it in Visual Studio if you want and import it, but we're going to keep things visual for the purpose of the demo. So I'm going to configure my UDA settings here. I'm going to call this Retrieve Leave Balance. And under Category, and the category is going to show up here on the left, I'm going to call it Human Resources Department, because I know in the future that I'm going to have more actions that are going to center around the Human Resources Department, and I want them to all show up in one place. So that's fine. Now we're going to need parameters. So again, we're going to have to put our little imagination hats on here. A parameter is basically an input and output that we configure for these actions. So you've noticed as I've configured the properties of other actions, I'm always putting in data, and then quite often I'm storing the output in a variable so that I can use that information later. And that's essentially what we're configuring here. So I'm going to set up a new parameter. I'm going to call this the requester. This is the person who is asking for the leave, and that's going to be an input. We're going to have to put that information in for the action to work. It's going to be text, and it's going to be required. And I'm going to use another parameter. I'm going to call that leave type. In fact, I'll call it leave requested, just to use different names for different actions. Input, again, is going to be text, and again, it's going to be required. And then finally, I need an output, and the output is going to be remaining leave. going to be output, and it's going to be a number. All right. Now we're ready to configure the action itself. So the action itself is going to be just like the other action. The only difference is that we're packaging it in a UDA. So there's our credentials, and refresh to get our web method, get hours, and our user will be, again, whoops, not the initiator. It'll be our parameter, the requester. And our leave type will be our parameter leave requested. And we're going to store the result in remaining leave. And we'll publish that. Okay, so now when we go back to our design and we refresh and open the workflow, then we can see that we have a new section in our toolbox called Human Resources Department. And instead of using this with all the SOAP code and configuration and credentials and all the scary technical stuff, we just have something very obvious. Retrieve leave balance, and if we open it up, then we've just got the parameters that we've specified. So the requester will be the initiator, the leave requested will be the leave type from the item, and the remaining leave we would store in a parameter that we could use later. Then we would be able to take that remaining leave and feed it back to the manager in the notification, just like we did when we were using the web service. So you can see how much easier it is to use this kind of thing. It's much easier for end users and power users, and it allows you to create these different integration points with whatever you've got on your network that can just be reused as often as needed without any real further explanation. Now, in the example, I just had a single action making up the user-defined action, but you can have as many actions as you want. You can have an entire workflow of 20 or 30 actions packed into that UDA. It's really up to you, as long as you can specify the input that it needs to start and the output that it's going to give when that whole process completes. As far as your designers are concerned, that's just a single action. So pretty powerful stuff. One of my favorites. All right, that's pretty much everything I wanted to show you leave request wise. So I'm going to take a few questions now. Please feel free to type in some additional ones. And I'll just get stuck right in. So I've got one here already. Will you provide a link to this webinar so I can review the video later? Yeah, absolutely. There is a page that you can use to view the demos and the webinars that we share and record. You'll receive an email, a URL in your email in less than a week with the location that you can use to download that video. So have no fear. Here's another one. Suppose we need to add users in a group, so we add groups, for example, managers. Is it a security group, an AD, or a distribution list? It can be either one. As you've pointed out, we have provisioning tools for Active Directory here, and you can add users to groups, be it a distribution group or a security group, and you can even provision mailboxes for them and assign them permissions, and even populate and manage their SharePoint profile as well. Yeah, so the answer is yes, both. Here's another one. What if you want to run a different workflow for those leave requests with special circumstances? Say these need to workflow in HR. How is this achieved? So you can have startup conditions for a workflow so that it'll only run if specific conditions are met. And just looking for it here. you can set up those conditions so that depending on the parameters of the form, a workflow may or may not start. So if you have 3 different departments, let's say, that are being served by this particular list, then you'd have 3 different workflows. And each of those different workflows would have conditional starts that would depend on the particular department being specified in that item. And the others wouldn't start because they'd be looking for a department that wasn't specified. That's one of the ways that you can manage that. If you want to do it all from a central list and have workflows split off, then you can do that as well. Let me see. Love the UDA. Going to have to play with that. The hours between is a bit messy. Any other way of doing that? Yeah, there's different ways to do that. One of the ways that you can calculate the hours, the business hours between 2 dates, is by using Excel services. So you can take an Excel spreadsheet, and there are functions within Excel that allow you to calculate the business hours, or at least the business days, between 2 calendar dates. And because we can access Excel services with this action here, under integration, we can query Excel services. If that spreadsheet is sitting in SharePoint, then you can feed it the dates and pull back the business days that result. I'm not sure about fractional days, though. If you've got people requesting half a day here and half a day there, you might want to review that function. But that's one of the ways that you can do it. If you've got other applications or other calculations you can use to find that value, then by all means you could use those tools as well. Here's another good question. How much of this can be done in Nintex 2007? So Nintex Workflow 2007 does not have the UDAs that I just showed you, although you can create custom activities in Visual Studio and import those, so you can still create custom actions, but you can't create UDAs. It's a Workflow 2010 feature. Nintex Workflow 2007 at present does not have Nintex Live either, so it doesn't have the catalog that I showed you of online services. However, if you still wanted to update an Office 365 site, you could still do that. You just have to use the web service action that I showed you, or perhaps a REST query is another, a web request action is another way that you could do it. You're basically having to put in more manual information. It's not quite as user-friendly as our action, but still possible. Another one, specifically, can I make user-defined actions using Visual Studio? So we sort of answered that. Our SDK for Workflow 2007, as well as the Workflow 2010 SDK, has information you can use to import Visual Studio custom activities and then package them up and expose them on the left as a drag-and-drop item. So essentially, yes, you're making a user-defined action, very similar. There's just a bit of coding involved. It's not a drag-and-drop experience like we've got here. If you've got Workflow 2010, then you can do both. You could create a custom activity in Visual Studio, import that, and have that be one of several actions hidden inside a user-defined action if you really wanted to. Here's another one. How can InfoPath forms be integrated? Boy, that's a long, a lot of long answers to that question. Probably the best thing to do to get InfoPath integration info is by going to connect.nintex.com. Connect.nintex.com is a really good site, and it's our portal on our Nintex workflow community. So it includes thousands of users and also our dev and support teams. And if you go to that site, you'll also see a whole bunch of downloads, white papers, how-to articles, install guides, things like that. That's probably the best place to go for InfoPath integration info, but largely you can do a lot of very interesting things with InfoPath. You can build approve and reject buttons onto the form. You can pick the next approver. You can really build whatever you want into it. And incidentally, all of our own web services in Nintex Workflow 2010, or at least 90% of our API is surfaced through our web services. So if you wanted to call workflow directly from an InfoPath form or from a website or another application entirely and kick off workflows and query for workflow statistics and that kind of thing, then you can do that as well. It's another form of integration. Can Intex help us in calculating number of days or number of hours, which should not include weekends and office holidays? There is a business day calendar that you can configure in Central Admin to help you with things like notifications. If you want to specify that you want notifications to happen only during business days and you only want to include business days in the elapsed time between notifications, then you can do that. We have a calendar that you can set, as I said, but it's not an on-the-fly calculation like the one that we discussed earlier, where you need to calculate the business days between two dates for the purpose of a workflow. Here's another good one. It's probably going to be our last question. We've got really good questions this session, so thank you. We've got through a lot of them, but I can see we're going to have a little bit of homework for the ones that we didn't get to. But this one was, I've lost it now. It was a question about if a web service fails, what do we do with the error? So we actually have error handling built in to our web service query. So let's drag that back on the screen and I'll show you how that works. At the bottom of the action, you've got an error handling section, and you can do a few things. You can capture the errors themselves, and you can store whether the result, whether or not an error has occurred, a yes or no value, it should be. And you can also store the text of the error itself. So the nice thing about being able to store whether an error has occurred or not is you can start to do clever things like branching based on whether or not an error has happened. So you might have a parallel action like this, and then you might have run if statements under each, where you run, or maybe just one, where there we go, where if an error has occurred, then do X, Y, Z, otherwise go ahead and run the other branch. In fact, you wouldn't even need a parallel action. You could do, in this example anyway, you could do it in a single action. You could even have a state machine instead of a parallel action where, depending on whether or not an error has occurred, you would execute one state. If it had occurred, you could execute one state, and you might use an operation like wait until or pause to hold everything in a pause state until an administrator goes and flips the switch. They might update a value in a list saying unpause, for example, and then you would move from the first state, which was paused, to the second state, which was running again, and then you might even make it cyclical, where it would check to see if an error has occurred at the end of every state, and if it had, it would go back and pause again. So you can build some interesting logic into those actions. You have the same kind of feature in our provisioning actions as well with Active Directory. If you get an error, you can start building logic handling around those errors. Okay, guys. Well, thanks again for the participation. I think we had a pretty good session. I'm very happy with your questions, and please feel free to fill out some info at the end when you log out about what you thought of the session and how we can make it better. And for those of you whose questions I didn't get to, you will certainly receive a response eventually. So hang in there. It might be a few days. And you will also receive a link that you can use to download the recording of the event. Bear in mind, we've got another one coming up in October. So check our events page at www.nintex.com to find out more information. Thanks, everybody, and I will see you at the next webinar.